I've lived in 5 or 6 different neighborhoods as an adult, and I would say this was one of the most welcoming neighborhoods I've ever moved into.
The first time that we came into the neighborhood was to see the house. So it was one of those things as I was driving through the neighborhood on Don Quixote or Don Fernando with all the beautiful trees and everything so green and lush, because this was August, so everything was still beautiful. It was, you know, it was almost like the neighborhood was welcoming us.
My daughter was 7 when we moved here. We needed a safer neighborhood because Mountain, the speed on that street was moving a little too fast. And we had to find a community where you could actually ride your bike around the neighborhood.
And we had been down here a couple of times before, dreaming that maybe someday we could live in this area. They had just started building homes down in here. And one Saturday morning, we went out to the drugstore to buy some stuff, and instead we came down and just looked around the neighborhood and ended up buying a house.
I tend to feel things rather than necessarily see what they look like. And this place felt right. We just saw it, and it felt right, and then the question was, could we make it work for us?
Mm-hmm. The most appealing parts of this for a young family are the abilities to ride your bike and walk around the neighborhood safely, and you know, get onto that bosque trail and, you know, just feel like you're out in nature.
This house was having an open house that day, so we just walked in and I just fell in love with it, and that's the end of the story. Well, it's the beginning of the story.
Tucked away between the river and its namesake, Rio Grande Boulevard, just north of Los Terranes, the neighborhood now known as Thomas Village was once lush North Valley farmland.
When I was researching Thomas Village neighborhood, a few people who had lived here quite a while said that, oh, and when I moved here, you know, there was a pasture over here and there were a few cows over there, and I was quite surprised because it doesn't look like that. I found out that this used to be a farm, a huge farm. Primarily, I think originally it was mostly fruit, you know, peaches and strawberries, etc., etc. And then later on, I think when they sold some of the property or did something with the property, then they started growing alfalfa and then had cows. So it really was a nice rural area, and it was just on the outskirts of Albuquerque. Well, I understand that Charles Mann, after doing some research, he bought some property or got some property, and he had really just been in the retail business. He had a few stores, I think, in Old Town, and got this property and decided to be a farmer, but had never been a farmer. And as I understand it, he researched how to farm and hired some people, I think primarily Hispanic people, to help him get things going here, and had a very prosperous farm. And I think they used to sell their produce in town and also some of it outside of New Mexico.
I can tell you that the property that Charles Mann purchased would have been purchased about 1912. Went back quite a ways. He was Charles Mann Jr. There was a senior who was involved in farming as well. And I think a brother, or maybe it would have been a first cousin or something, named John Mann. So the Manns were big farmers in this area back in the early 20th century, perhaps even the late 19th century.
In 2007, longtime resident Dick Ruddy decided to track down descendants of Charles Mann and located daughters Charlene and June.
Charles Mann had 7 daughters, and 2 of them were still living here in Albuquerque at the time. And so Gail and I invited them to come out. And so we sat in the park and chatted with them and got them to reminisce about what it was like to live here. We were going to write a story about them in the newsletter, and they, as I recall, said, why don't we just write it for you and we'll give it to you. And they were very poetic about it.
We're well into the fall, and the trees in your yards are vibrant with color as we drive down memory lane. Your homes weren't here when we lived in this area. There were no paved streets, street signs, mailboxes, or streetlights. In those days, there were beautiful fruit trees and fields full of produce.
Then they went on and said the farm was especially beautiful in the spring
with orchards in full bloom and fields full of strawberries. From spring to fall, the stick-straight rows of crops were a sight to behold, with vegetables ripening into a multitude of colors. The show continued through fall with yellow-tasseled corn stalks, purple-flowering alfalfa fields, golden-hued cottonwood trees, and ristras drying in the sun.
As near as they could tell, where the Dulcinea Park is today, that's where the Mann home was, where they lived. And they described it, the house that was built by their father.
It was a large adobe home with a metal roof. We could hear the rain on the roof and felt cooled by the large cottonwood trees that surrounded the house.
And then World War II happened, and for whatever reason, Albuquerque was selected as one of the areas for a POW camp.
The federal government set up Camp Albuquerque for German POWs on 2nd Street, south of downtown, on land donated by the Schwartzman family. It was one of several POW camps scattered throughout New Mexico. The POWs were housed at the camp from July 1944 to March 1946. With the local labor force depleted by World War II, the prisoners were leased out to local farmers for 80 cents a day. Many of them worked on her father's 100-acre farm, recalled June Mann in a 2007 interview.
When he started getting prisoners, he would get 20 every other day. Each German prisoner had a specialty. They grew the best vegetables and they were hard workers. They would come with a lunch of a peanut butter sandwich, and my mother would say, "Those boys cannot work with only a peanut butter sandwich for lunch." So she cooked them lunch every day. But what was so amazing with these German prisoners was how they hated Hitler. They said he was a lunatic. They would converse with my mother because she could speak German. When they left, they went to England. We would get letters from them.
That German POWs were used by a number of different farms here in the North Valley. They put their real heart into being good farm workers, and which was an intelligent thing to do. They got some benefit out of the day, and life was worthwhile for them. So it was fairly big operation. They had here on property where the Meadows is today, right up against the Rio Grande Boulevard, it was a big Quonset hut, and that's where they sold vegetables. The property that's today the 4 neighborhoods that comprise the Thomas Village Neighborhood Association, pretty much all of that land, and maybe even a little bit more, was the Mann farm.
Charles Mann Jr., who had once acted as postmaster in Old Town, dabbled in local politics, and served on the first board of the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, died in the fields he loved of an apparent heart attack in 1968.
Down in Thomas Village, I remember when my dad first actually bought the property. It was the old Mann estate. It was about 60, I think it was 65 acres that he had actually bought between Rio Grande Boulevard and the river. And we actually lived up in the Northeast Heights, so we never did live there. But he bought it for the reason for development. But at first he was really intrigued with the land because he wanted to raise cattle.
When developer Thomas Krupiak began building Thomas Village estates in the mid-1970s, the area still retained its rural flavor.
We were surrounded by alfalfa fields, and that's where we got to know Tom Krupiak, because he owned those fields and had his cattle grazing out in those fields. And they would sometimes get loose and they would show up in our front yard. And the cows weren't so bad, but the bull was a little difficult to handle.
We used to get calls even before the subdivision started from the people in Duranes. "Mr. Krupiak, your cattle are going through Duranes." So he'd say, okay. So he'd wake me up and I'd go down with him, and we'd go down through the streets, and we'd be herding them back through the hole that they went through and trying to push them back down back into the fields. So it was pretty funny. And then there was people over on Rio Grande Boulevard that knew him also. They would call him in the middle of the night, and they were, sure enough, He had Black Angus headed down Rio Grande Boulevard.
When we came in, there was a herd of about 30 Black Angus cattle. Some people refer to them as cows, but coming from Wisconsin, I know what a cow looks like. And these were cattle, beef cattle. So we got to know them. They were like neighbors.
Right over here, out our front door, was just a field of the cattle, and so you could hear them. We'd eat dinner in our little dining room, and you could hear them actually munching their food right across the road.
The classic was the day we found 10 cattle in our front yard.
And we had just had a new lawn put in, so it was not a happy occasion. We called the animal control late at night, and they said, we don't do cows and cattle, and we don't do them late at night. So next morning, the people from the animal control showed up, and they were there right at the crack of dawn, and sort of herded the cattle away. But a little herd of cattle can destroy a lawn in just before you can even blink an eye. You know, they just eat it up and they're gone. Your lawn is gone. It was really sad to see the cows go. I think a lot of people felt that way. And the first time when the cows all went, I stood out there and cried because my neighbors had all been taken away.
Quixote, who fell in love with Hispanic culture after living in Barelas, left another mark on the budding subdivision. Street names derive from Miguel Cervantes' classic, Don Quixote.
And when I would introduce myself and they'd say, where do you live? I said, I live on La Mancha. I'm the man from La Mancha. And some people would say, huh? I'd say, you know, like the book?
The Don Quixote of La Mancha, and he used to talk up to my mom about it. I remember him telling my mom, these stories of Don Quixote of La Mancha is just exciting, you know. He loved the stories so much that he thought it was an adventure. So he figured, this is my adventure. That's what my dad thought. He said, okay, this is my adventure. I bought this property. I'm going to relate it to Don Quixote of La Mancha. And I remember him actually talking about that. That was really funny you say that now, because he used to say the stories and the night Don Quixote of La Mancha became a knight. And he knighted himself and he went out and had his adventures. And he said, I am Don Quixote of Albuquerque. It was pretty funny. He had Calle de Estela, which is my mom, Calle de Danielle, my brother, Calle de Deborah, my oldest sister, and Calle de Lara, which is my youngest sister. And he didn't name a street after Calle de Tomas because he told me, and I'm sure it was because of him, but he told me that he named the subdivision after me. That's what he told me. He says, I named the subdivision after you, son, because you were my first son. So I said, okay, cool, Dad, that's cool. Now I know it was probably named after him, I'm sure.
And then there's all the Dons over in the townhomes. Don Pablo, Don Pedro, you know, there's several, Don Fernando. And when people, our guests or family would come in from out of town, they'd say, they've named all these streets after you, Don. I said, well, not quite.
I think his vision was correct. I think he had a vision. My dad always had a vision of a subdivision before it even happened. He had a few up in the Heights that he did also. And he made it turn into something that he knew it would be, and which was absolutely gorgeous down there. It's a beautiful subdivision. I think my dad was very, very proud of it.
It now appeared to him fitting and necessary, in order to win a greater amount of honor for himself and serve his country at the same time, to become a knight-errant and roam the world on horseback in a suit of armor. He would go in quest of adventures, by way of putting into practice all that he had read in his books. He would right every manner of wrong, placing himself in situations of the greatest peril, such as would redound to the eternal glory of his name. As a reward for his valor and the might of his arm, the poor fellow could already see himself crowned Emperor of Trebizond at the very least. And so, carried away by the strange pleasure that he had found in such thoughts as these, he at once set about putting his plan into effect. As the neighborhood grew, other developers entered the picture, divvying up the once picturesque farmland.
There are 4 areas within Thomas Village. Thomas Village Estates, and then there's the patio homes, Thomas Village patio homes, and there's about 70 of those. And adjacent to Thomas Village, the patio homes, is Abbey Jean, and that's 9 townhouses. And then finally, it's the Meadows, and there's about 110, 120 homes in the Meadows. And that was the last group of homes that was built. There's one neighborhood association, and the Thomas Village Estates, the first grouping, does not have a homeowners association. But the other 3 do. The neighborhood association kind of worked with them to see if they were interested in kind of the neighborhood association being the umbrella association for the whole group.
The neighborhood soon attracted an eclectic and distinguished group of professionals and politicians.
Well, Thomas Village, when we moved here, was called the mayor's neighborhood because Mayor Baca and Mayor Chavez both lived here. And when I moved in, then there's this old-time city councilor also joining in. And somebody said we should change it to call it the politician's neighborhood.
We have former university presidents, city attorneys, a couple of mayors, great book authors, just all sorts of interesting people.
We have had a dean of the law school here. We've had actually the most recognized radiologist from the medical school living here, the guy that went to Chernobyl and helped the Ukrainians and the Russians and whoever was involved take care of a lot of the damage done at Chernobyl.
Our current mayor, Keller, his in-laws live here. And the race car driver, Mr. Unser, used to live here, I believe.
The head of the American Medical Association.
We have authors. A really leading science fiction writer lives here.
And I don't know how we all congregated here, it just happened over time.
One of the benefits of living in Thomas Village was the proximity to the Rio Grande bosque. It was only a matter of time before residents figured out how to safely access it.
Originally, there was just this wooden plank across this ditch down at the end of the subdivision. And you sort of took your life in your hands to cross this drainage ditch if you wanted to go out to the river. So the neighborhood back then decided, well, we really need something better than that. So Pat Bryan went out and found an old concrete beam and got permission from the Conservancy District just to set that thing across the ditch. And that lasted for about maybe a year and a half, and there was a tremendous rainstorm and a lot of erosion around the bridge, and it just fell into the ditch. So we decided, Bobby, the civil engineer, decided maybe this thing needs to be engineered.
And so when I was president of the neighborhood association, several of us on the board said we wanted to build a bridge. And I said, okay, let's see what we can do to recruit the various, construction materials we needed. And we had a really helpful fellow by the name of Jasper Coombs. But he worked for the Army Corps of Engineers. And he said, Don, I can help design an abutment on both sides of that ditch. Hydro Conduit delivered this twin T beam, and we brought the big crane in, and they set it in place on the abutments that we had built. And then after that, the city said, okay, you've got a nice little bridge here, but there's no guardrail or anything else. We will put that in for you. And the city did.
And so one of the things that was great was here we could be 10 minutes from downtown, 12 minutes from the university, and a 5-minute walk from not seeing anybody and being out in nature. what a luxury to be in that perfect in-between place.
And it really opened up this neighborhood to a lot of capability for hiking in the bosque and walking dogs out on the river and just taking the kids out there to see the Rio Grande. You know, it's made a big difference to the neighborhood for bicyclists and hikers and walkers that go out and kind of be with nature in the bosque.
So that was really a fun, very satisfying project that everybody to this day really enjoys, and we use it constantly.
While the bridge to the bosque brought residents closer to nature, it was also a reminder that disaster was not far away.
In 2003, there was a major fire, and from what I understand, people that were closer to the bosque trail, some of those people were asked to move.
You guys live near here?
Yeah, we live right here in our right in this neighborhood. In our neighborhood.
This ditch. Clear this area.
Okay.
Now. Not far away, Margaret Chavez, the mayor's wife, sprays what she can with a garden hose. But then,
Come on, everybody, let's work together.
the fire gets too close.
Get the water over here. Hey, get your hose over. Come on, it's burning.
Neighbors stomp out to spot fire, but there's panic. The neighborhood's evacuated.
It's a good thing I have that little hose because that little hose helped put out that fire next door.
Worried residents are forced to leave. The mayor's house and every other house along La Mancha, one of Albuquerque's worst nightmares, was coming true.
It actually did burn some stuff on this side of the ditch, on the east side of the ditch. And if it had gotten into some of the trees over here, it would have been a different story.
Though it didn't always take a fire to rally neighbors.
Our neighborhood has kind of become famous for Halloween. And right here on Rosanante Street, we have a bunch of people that really decorate their houses and put up all sorts of scary haunted houses. And we have a guy that has spiders mounted on radio-controlled cars that chase kids down the street.
I love the macabre, but Halloween has always been one of my favorite holidays, even more than Christmas. One of my first neighbors that I got to be introduced into the haunting thing was my neighbors Steve and Jerry that live a little bit down the street. Steve is big in the Halloween, so of course, in October he had these huge 40-foot blow-up cats in his yard. And I was just like, okay, that's amazing. I had to walk down and talk to this guy. The first couple of years, it was just he and I. We would do these big elaborate displays in the yard, and the kids would just go crazy. And then we started talking to other neighbors, hey, maybe you should put stuff up in your yard. So they started to do it. And next thing you know, the thing exploded, and we were on Google Maps shortly after that as a safe trick-or-treat destination. And it was massive, but on our old street, there were probably 3 or 4 trick-or-treaters. The first time we did something here, there were like 1,000 kids in the neighborhood. We were short candy. The wife had to go out and go get more at that point in time because we were taken back by what was going on. But we've had people as far as Bernalillo, Las Lunas, Rio Rancho come to the neighborhood to check things out and then say what a great time they have and go home, you know. And I think that they tell friends, you know, like, hey, you should come down here.
Despite its seemingly idyllic setting, Thomas Village, like most Albuquerque neighborhoods, faces challenges in maintaining its welcoming environment.
The biggest challenge right now is the same one we have anywhere in this city, and that is the theft and burglary. And we've been broken into. A lot of the people we know have been broken into down here, and we just can't seem to get a handle on it.
Thomas Village is not a gated community, and most of us prefer that. We don't want that reclusive feel. We don't want that exclusive feel. We want to be open to people. The downside of that is when you have an open community, you know, anybody can come in here. And so we have some crime problems, some theft, but probably not unlike other parts of Albuquerque. I don't know that we're exceptional.
A few times people have thought about putting gates up on entryways when some of the theft got too big, but I'm just not for it. I don't think gated communities are good for a city. I really don't. I didn't think that as mayor, and I don't think it now. And there was other considerations too. These are public streets in here, public park, public utilities, and essentially if you're going to gate your community, you're going to have to buy all that from the city.
I don't want a ambulance having to figure out how they're going to get into a gated community when I'm having a heart attack. Thank you.
We have enough divisions, okay? We have enough divisions of income, of color, of everything else, and I think all a gated community does is more or less say that's okay. But it's just the message is we don't want you here, whoever you are. And I don't think that's the way a community thrives.
That sense of community has attracted an influx of families with young children, a second growth of sorts for Thomas Village.
The thing we have always tried to do from the very early days of Thomas Village is to be so neighborly and to keep our eye on everything else.
Thomas Village is a very close-knit community. You know, neighbors are always watching out for each other. If you leave your garage door open, someone's going to come over and tell you. You know, before we even moved in and we were just looking at the house, the neighbors were coming over and saying hi to us and welcoming us to the neighborhood. You know, there's an email list that's been going on forever where people, you know, buy and sell things or just put out alerts to the neighborhood. And yeah, much more than any other place we've lived in Albuquerque for sure. It's a very tight-knit community.
On the day that we moved in, we were unloading, and all of the neighbors came over to greet us. And I can't remember who was who because there were so many, and it was all at once. And everyone was coming with, oh, here are the cherry tomatoes from our garden, or here's, you know, a welcome home basket, and here's, you know, my information so you can contact us if you need something. So, it was overwhelming, but in a pleasant way.
Just very nice. And they were excited to have a young family move in too. You know, I think this was a neighborhood that, this side of the neighborhood at least, got settled in the 80s and 90s. So, you know, it's that generational turnover, I think, as young families start to move back in.
We feel very comfortable to let our kids go out into the streets and, you know, draw with sidewalk chalk or ride their bikes or rollerblade or whatever activities that we want to do outside. We feel really comfortable, and night or day, to do that, which is pretty neat because in our other neighborhood it didn't have that same feel.
I think it's just nice to feel like you're a little bit secluded, but it's also so easy to get to things that you do a lot with kids, like the zoo and the bio park and all of the museums down in Old Town.
I think this community, and this neighborhood specifically, is so close-knit because there are so many ways to bring everyone together. And then the annual picnic that we have, the Friday luncheons, and even the younger families throughout the neighborhood, even in the front part, we all have this group text. So there are about 16 families on the group text. So they say, oh, our cul-de-sac is gonna have dinner, you know, it's potluck. Bring your own dinner, bring your kids, you know, bring something to do, it's something, you know, bikes or chalk or something, and go and hang out.
So what does the future hold for Thomas Village?
Probably a lot of people just don't want anything to ever change in this neighborhood. They like it so much. But change is always going to occur, and there's going to be things that some of us like and don't like. But generally, we like to keep our quality of life down here.
And we need to allow that change to happen and encourage it. As some of us age more, I think one of the challenges is for the next generation that is coming with their kids to sort of take over. And those of us, the older of us, need to allow them to take over. And just we need to be the rooting, the cheering section. And I think there's some younger families in the neighborhood that are working really hard on that.
Perhaps the neighborhood theme of Don Quixote is not so far-fetched. To think that the affairs of this life always remain in the same state is a vain presumption. Indeed, they all seem to be perpetually changing and moving in a circular course. Spring is followed by summer, summer by autumn, and autumn by winter, which is again followed by spring, and so time continues its everlasting round. But the life of man is ever racing to its end, swifter than time itself, without hope of renewal, unless in the next, that is limitless and infinite.
The fact that the man from La Mancha is embodied here, it's just as great a fantasy as you can think of, but really there are people living here.
You can't be immune to crime or, some things that are happening. It's not completely, Pleasantville or Sunshineville or whatever it is, Leave It to Beaver. But I think I don't mean to brag, but in our cul-de-sac, it almost feels that way.
I love the community and like how the neighbors pull together to have parties or talk to each other when they're having parties. Like, hey, we're going to be loud for a little bit. Perfect. What more could you ask for? Besides an invite. But I mean, it's the community base of the neighborhood. People actually know each other in this neighborhood, and that makes it wonderful. And I think all neighborhoods should work like that.
I would have a hard time thinking of anything that can be improved in this neighborhood. Every once in a while, I think it would be nice if we had sidewalks, because people walk in the street, and sometimes people don't pay attention to really stopping at the stop signs. And so if there were sidewalks, it might be a little bit safer. But that's the only thing I can think of.
This is the best investment I've ever made. Well, the second best investment I've ever made.
Never thought of myself as an investment before, but that's okay.
So it's so in answer to your question, it works. It works.
A great variety of talent. It's sort of a cross-section of America. Maybe I don't want to be too judgmental, but at least, if not the best, a good part of the good things of America.